I thought that like the way that they had Sauron almost as like a living void or a living shadow, and then inverting to form the eye with like the flames around him, I was like, that is a brilliant way of like portraying the unportrayable.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us one of our guests, Philip Dutt, alongside a new guest, Jared Stonefield, to discuss the second in the trilogy installment of The Hobbit, known as The Desolation of Smaug. This was directed by Peter Jackson with a screenplay by Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, Peter Jackson, and, of course, Guillermo del Toro, again, for a second round of screenplay writing. But before we get into the details of this film, as always, we want to get initial impressions. What do people think when they first think of The Desolation of Smaug? Philip, what was your first takeaway after watching this?
Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit with the takeaway that I had like from the very first time I watched it, which was back like whenever it came out. So the Hobbit book, just by the way, is probably the book I've read most of all Middle-earth books, and I know the storyline fairly well. So going into it, I kind of had this idea of what to expect. So I thought the ending of like the first movie was good. And where the second movie then started off with, I was like, this is great. Because I think that like Peter Jackson tossed up whether he wanted there to be 2 or 3 movies at some point. So I think going into the second movie kind of either like thought there were only going to be 2 or whatever. So anyways, so like for the most part, the movie like I think went along in like in a good way until you get to like Tauriel. From my opinion. And that's just where like the movie just starts to water down.
Sure.
It isn't so much that like I know it says I thought the first movie was good, and then it goes into the second one, and it's like starts out well, and I think just kind of slowly climbs into like kind of watering down things, spreading out the storyline in some ways, especially by the time you get to Dale, like the Lord and Steward guys, like I think you could remove them entirely.
Interesting.
You could remove them entirely. And you wouldn't like you could have them as like a side characters, and they wouldn't even hardly affect the storyline. And then you get to like when Smaug like doesn't destroy Dale. To me, was just like, wait a second, how are they gonna do this
in the next?
How are they doing this in the next movie? All of a sudden, you have a cut for him flying towards Dale, and I'm like, wait a second. Like, the Battle of the Five Armies is one chapter in the book.
Right.
And they're going to make a whole movie off of it.
Yeah.
So, that was anyways. That was kind of like my takeaway from it.
No, then...
Like, I think it's cool to see, like, Legolas and, like, and some other, like, things that you wouldn't get just from reading the book, even.
Sure.
But
sure. Nice. Well, Jared, what were your initial takeaways after watching The Desolation of Smaug?
So the first time I watched this, I was like absolutely obsessed with it. Because it has dragons, it has Sauron and Gandalf and all these dwarves. 14-year-old me was thriving watching this. Looking back, I think my enjoyment of it is still there for sure. I think it's just been tempered a bit with just looking at it a little bit more critically, a little bit more analytically.
Sure.
I think that it's a well-made movie that struggles under the weight of its own expectations. I think that people, just the general audience, but also especially like studio executives, were wanting this to be the next Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit isn't Lord of the Rings. It was never meant to be like the Lord of the Rings. So Desolation of Smaug, I think, can unfairly get compared to, or was like put up next to, the Two Towers, which I think is just a bizarre comparison, and I don't think that The Hobbit was meant to be kind of shown in that kind of light. So having the movie split up into 3 was very interesting, and I think that this movie kind of suffers a bit as a result.
Yeah, it's very interesting, even going back to first hearing that this would be a 3-part film, going, okay, how are they going to have content for 3 parts? And then you hear, oh, they're bringing stuff in like the Necromancer, and you go, okay, well, maybe there's enough stuff there. We'll see. And so, really trying to see that play out if they did that successfully is more so a big question in this film and the next film compared to the very first one, An Unexpected Journey, which has it has enough content, I suppose. You know, I even argue, if you've listened to the first part of the Hobbit reviews, I think critically of how long they spread out that first one, but even with that, you can make some case for that. In this case, they definitely needed that additional content to make it as long as they did. Now, does that make it a good story? That's the discussion for today, right? So that's what we're going to get into. But before we do that, Jared, can you tell those who are unfamiliar with the plot what The Desolation of Smaug is about?
Yeah, of course. So, really quickly, we pretty much pick up where the first film left off with Bilbo and the dwarves going through the wilderness. They come up on the edge of Mirkwood. Gandalf, unfortunately, has to leave them at this point because there are whispers of Sauron returning, which he eventually finds out are true whispers and rumors because Sauron is back and hiding in the fortress of Dol Guldur, and unfortunately, Gandalf gets captured as a result. But meanwhile, Bilbo and the hobbits make their way through Mirkwood. They meet characters like Thranduil, Legolas, and Tauriel, and then they make their way down to Lake Town, where they meet a whole other crew of characters, including the Master and Bard the Bowman. And then the dwarves finally start to make their way towards the Lonely Mountain. Once they get inside, Bilbo recovers the Arkenstone from the dragon Smaug. The dwarves try to fight Smaug, but it ends up not going well, and the movie ends with a threatening shot of Smaug flying towards Lake Town.
Nice. Concise as it gets. I love it. So, we use the 9-point rating system to review podcasts on this film. And if any of you have listened to this before, this isn't new, but it's not necessarily the way to determine if a film is good or not. But the point of the 9 points is to get you to think critically about how the plot was developed, how they created certain elements in the story and made them, and was it effective or was it not? So, based on the 9 points, either a general or specific rating, Philip, what did you get for this film?
Yeah, so I think that I would give it a mediocre rating. Definitely, if I was in a ballpark, I would say like a B. I would give it a B. Definitely.
Okay.
And I guess like my biggest thing is like just getting down to it. I think that I appreciate the way that The Hobbit was told, and the way that they like, I guess the way that they tell the story, they're kind of, as I said before, watering down things. But maybe like you were saying too, Maverick, they could have taken parts of the Desolation of Smaug and maybe put it into the first movie if they didn't have, they were kind of like stretching that more for even, content. But I just like, it just also like goes, I mean, just to kind of like extrapolate, it goes down to the third movie, which it also affects as being like poor quality movie. And that I think is because of the way they did the this movie in particular. I think that like, I still think that like the first movie was pretty good. I thought they got worse as they went along, basically. So they really it's like the barrels definitely didn't need that much time.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get into all of that in a bit. But yeah. So
okay.
Yeah, no, don't worry. We will cover that. I will make sure we cover the barrels. Believe me.
Okay. No, yeah, just saying like those are some reasons.
Yeah.
I have like for like kind of against it in a sense.
Sure.
But I mean, I did enjoy watching it too.
Yeah.
To think back on that, like, because I know what's coming, my expectations weren't subverted so much.
Sure.
So like, I was able to like kind of enjoy this compared to like the first time. And it's been a while since I've read the book too. So
and it is interesting, just going on a tangent along that, is that especially if you're taking the rating system and you're looking at that section all about subverted expectations, right? And did they do that effectively? You kind of have to take your like second time viewer glasses off if it is the second time you viewed it and go, okay, was this something I was surprised about when I first heard about it, saw it, that kind of thing. So you'd have to keep those things in mind, but generally, yes, that shouldn't affect the enjoyability too much. But kicking it back to Jared, what was your rating of this film?
7 out of 9.
7 out of 9. Okay, that's pretty solid. That's not a bad rating at all.
I kind of oscillate between 6 out of 9 and 7 out of 9.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe like 6.5.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to be that person.
no, that's fair. Personally, myself, it got. Let me pull this back up to be sure I don't mess it up. Yeah, it was a 4.5 out of 9. So a solid, right down the middle for me. I do enjoy a lot of things about this film. Especially Smaug, how he's portrayed, awesome, and they build him up very well. Some of the spiders look really epic. Personally, Thranduil is a very intriguing character to me, so I think they do some elements of this film very well. And even watching it, I think this is the second time, maybe. I don't think I watched it. Yeah, I think this is the second time I ever watched it. Or maybe the third. Actually, that would be the third because I watched. Never mind. I watched all 3 in a row in theaters when the third one came out. Why I did that, I don't know. It was very fun. Anyways, so this would be the third time I've ever watched it. There's things that I caught this time that I didn't realize looking back, and it's very interesting to see. I think this film falls on its face a lot because of what they don't put in this one and what they do put in the next one. But we'll get into that. So, anyways, let's start off the film right off the bat. You get that opening scene with Bilbo seeing that they're still being chased by the Warg Riders and Azog and his crew. And then you get Bjorn and the whole thing with the bear shape-shifting man who then allows him to enter his home because he hates orcs more than he hates dwarves. What was your guys' impression of the opening of this film? Jared, if you want to start us right off the bat, what do you think?
Yeah. I think it's like good that it actually continues off right from where we see in the first film. And I think having Bjorn as a like opening kind of scene, opening kind of introduction to the story, I don't think is necessarily like a bad choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that they like include him from the books. But when you look at it in the rest of the context of the movie, it does seem a little odd because it's just like Bjorn does not fit into the rest of the story at all. And he has no relevance again until the very end of the third movie where he shows up again. And this is not at all to like critique the Hobbit's story, like book itself, which is written, you know, as just like a complete, very different type of story, almost a fairy tale type.
Right.
Just having him here in this movie, it is a little bizarre. And then you kind of like by the end of the movie, I continually forget that he was ever in this movie.
Yeah.
Like every time this movie opens up and Bjorn's in it, I'm like, oh yeah, you, hello.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's necessarily like a bad one, and it's good that it kicks up the action right away. I really enjoy that. And it plays a bit on like how dwarves are perceived by outsiders, because after the end of the first movie, you're like, you got a little warm feeling. You're like, oh, Bilbo and the dwarves love each other, and then you kind of like get to Bjorn, and he's like, he hates dwarves, and you're like, okay, dwarves are a little, rough, and I can see how that's gonna actually that kind of plays thematically into the rest of the movie. How like people view dwarves, I think, is a big recurring thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a little bit of like issues with it in just the terms of like in the movie overall, but I think it's a overall like fairly decent opening.
Yeah, totally agree. Philip, what were your? And actually, ironically enough, I was thinking the same thing about Bjorn when I first watched it. And I still, to this time, it's like Bjorn is such an interesting character because he's a whole kind of like going off a completely different tangent, but like Tom Bombadil with the Rings of Power, right? Totally different character from the rest of the universe, and you don't even really get the full degree of that in the Rings of Power yet. But it's almost like he's almost just like there, and you get that with Bjorn a bit, where it's like, oh, you're here, like not even sure what to do with you, and then we just kind of move on. So
I I don't even think Tolkien knew what to do with him because the shape changers never appear in any other like Middle Earth lore ever.
Interesting.
Like Beorn's people, they never show up again. It's bizarre.
Nice. Philip, what were your thoughts? Just continuing off of that.
Yeah, and even like the pace of things seemed to be good and like keeping you interested, and I think I said they didn't waste things there. Yeah, I mean, I just felt like the way they led up to things, even to like Mirkwood overall, like I enjoyed seeing Beor. I know like the unique parts of the story I think are cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting in the book, and like Jared could like correct me on this, but it doesn't seem like Tolkien really puts into much detail about like a ton of different situations, and that he just kind of moves through a lot of things, a lot of different, like the spiders or anything like they're talked about. But it is interesting how like later on in the movie things start to like more details kind of and more characters start to appear.
Yeah, and I haven't read the books recently at all, but my general impression, even rewatching it this time, was going, okay, there's definitely a lot of detail, especially like with Lake Town and stuff like that. I'm sure is just not in the books. So taking creative license to some degree, you're going to have to do, but also just looking at that more from a standpoint of, did this help the plot, or was it more of a I guess gimmick? Like, here's the thing about Bjorn, and maybe play off of this, agree or disagree, but as much as I think Bjorn's an interesting character, I almost think the plot would be better if they showed them getting on horses at the Eagle's place and then just show them at Markwood 20 seconds later. Just because I don't know how much Bjorn actually adds to the plot at that point.
I kind of agree. Like, here's the problem with adapting The Hobbit, is that The Hobbit is told in a traditional kind of fairy tale, almost like legend type format, which is very episodic. So like you can especially see that in the first movie, you know,
right.
You have the whole thing with the trolls, you have the whole thing with Rivendell, you have the whole thing with the Goblin Cave. And that continues well on into the book until probably about like 2/3 of the way through. So the problem is that like some of those episodes are not as important as others, and Beorn kind of ends up being one of those. So having him in the movie, like you could theoretically take out Beorn's scene, and it would be a stronger movie in and of itself for Desolation of Smaug. I also totally agree. I argue that Desolation of Smaug for me really finds its pace once they entered Mirkwood.
Right.
I think that's where it really starts to take off.
Right. And you could say, for example, Beorn adds the foreboding of Mirkwood with that conversation with Gandalf and whatnot in the woods. Well, you could have that conversation with an eagle or any other character, so it's really not necessary. But definitely, Mirkwood sets the pace for a lot of the rest of the film to a certain degree. Is this idea of there's a lot of foreboding in this film, and the build-up in this film is probably one of the stronger parts of this film. Like, you hear about Smaug, and even when, jumping a little bit ahead, but just to give you the idea of how well they do this, right? The foreboding of Smaug is going from the beginning of the first film all the way into 3/4 of the way through this film, where you just see his eye, and then you see his snout, and then you see the tip of his wing, and it slowly reveals this massive creature, which is the terror that has destroyed Dale and done all these other terrible acts, right? And so the foreboding, the build-up is very good in this film.
And they deliver on the promise of dread with like the Smaug reveal too, which I think is really hard, and I think it like deserves a lot of credit in this movie.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Kind of kicking back to a conversation before we get too far ahead. This movie, right, starts off with Bilbo being rushed into an adventure with a bunch of dwarves that he hadn't really agreed to be on an adventure with, but then ends up kind of getting strong-armed into, right? One of the conversations I had with the guest on that last podcast was the discussion of, in the film, there is a strong emphasis on Thorin as a main character compared to Bilbo. What are your guys' thoughts on that discussion, especially in light of this film? Do you think that Thorin is the main character, or do you think that Bilbo is the primary lead?
It's difficult with this, because the story, I think, is supposed to be told from Bilbo's perspective, just originally. So they're trying to give you that, which, they definitely give you with the spiders, because you're following Bilbo and the spiders, and you're following Bilbo and whenever he gets into the elves as well. But at the same time, though, the build up around the story, though, is about Thorin reclaiming, Erebor, and then joining up the seven dwarven, peoples.
Right.
And anyway, so, yeah, I can definitely see how Thorin could be the leading character, but I don't know, man. I just feel like there are so many different ways that Bilbo gets them out of obstacles, and Bilbo's kind of the one that makes it all work.
Right. Well, and here's another thing that you see more in this film compared to the previous one, which might addendum what I just asked you guys, is you see the divergence of the Necromancer plot even more in this film compared to the previous one, which then begs the question, is Gandalf one of the main characters now? Especially because you have that whole discussion with him and Radagast where he goes, my friends are in danger, and Radagast goes, well, the world is in danger. And there's almost a sense in which they put the perspective that Gandalf's conflict is far more important than the conflict with the dwarves and Bilbo. So is he the main character? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
No, yeah, I think that's a really good point with these movies, is that it's very hard to establish a main character, because especially in Desolation of Smaug, Bilbo is very much like the POV character. Several shots and several scenes are filmed from his POV, especially Mirkwood.
Right.
Almost the entirety of Mirkwood you see through Bilbo's eyes. And it's in the book as well, obviously. But the thing is that Thorin has kind of the more emotional stakes. And Bilbo acknowledges this in the first movie. Thorin and the dwarves have the most emotional stake in Desolation of Smaug, and I think especially in the next movie, Battle of Five Armies, where Thorin really, I think, starts to become the main character. Mm-hmm. Bilbo's kind of shunted out almost,
right,
just by necessity in the story. But that's the thing is with Gandalf too, is Gandalf is our only way into seeing what's behind the Hobbit, mm-hmm. which Tolkien was just starting to figure out in the book really at this point. So the only way you can see that is through Gandalf. So it's almost like when in a book where you have multiple POVs every few chapters, right. Every time you get to a good cliffhanger, it switches to another character's POV. That's what I think these movies start to become. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing,
sure,
but I think it makes things a little bit more muddled or a little bit more confusing.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's totally fair. It makes it a little harder for you, because I think, especially when it comes to having a single POV, it's very easy to get invested in that singular character. When you have multiple characters, it's not necessarily that you can't get invested in all of them, but that means you have to build up each character individually so that you care enough that when something happens to them, you're concerned they might die, or that you really want them to achieve their goal. So it definitely just builds a harder task for the creators of the story. That being said, if you're watching the extended edition, this movie is 3 hours long. So if they don't build investment in 3 hours, that's on the writers. That's not on you as the audience. Anyways, yeah, I think those are definitely interesting thoughts. We'll go through each of those characters one by one to get an idea of their individual stakes. But let's start off with the stereotypical protagonist, Bilbo. You see him from that point go into Mirkwood and help with the dwarves. And really, let's go through his journey. How do you think they develop him as a character from especially where he started in the last film? And either of you can take that.
Go for it, Jared.
Okay, yeah. So I think they do actually a pretty decent job, because in the first film, it's more of does Bilbo actually want to like stay with these dwarves? And then it finally like comes to the decision point at the end of the first movie, and so you get to start off the second movie with him fully committed to being with the dwarves. But what's the price of that commitment? And the price of that commitment is facing off a dragon by yourself in an underground cavern, which is, terrifying. And, it shows the consequence of Bilbo's choice. And so I think that's actually like a pretty good thing that they added, like, or that they developed or built upon. So getting to see like Bilbo really stick to his guns and also just really try to find his courage in this one, even more so than the last one. Because in the last one, the big climactic moment is Bilbo rushing to Thorin's aid to defend him from a wolf.
Right.
In this movie, Bilbo's big climactic moment is facing off a dragon for one of the most valuable gems in Middle Earth.
Right.
I think that's a pretty good step up, build up, for Bilbo.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think one of my critiques of the first one had to do with the growth payoff of Bilbo as a character. And if you watch that, I didn't hate that film, to be perfectly clear, but there was definitely areas where I thought it was lacking. So it's interesting because I think you get some payoff in this one that was really built off of the first one, but you don't see it as much as I think you should have in the first one. I think the build-up in this one doesn't get the full payoff until the next one. So maybe there's like a lag or something in the development, and we'll get to that in a second. But before I jump the gun too quickly, Philip, what are your thoughts?
With at least with Bilbo's character development, if you're just thinking about that, like like what kind of obstacles I guess does he go against? And like Jared was saying, you got Smaug at the end, and of course he becomes like their burglar, right? That was the whole point from like the first movie.
Right.
And so he becomes the burglar. He's like saves them from the spiders. He saves them from the elves, and he supposedly he might steal the Arkenstone. We don't know.
It's true. They don't actually show him taking it, but they insinuate. Yeah. Anyways, keep going.
Yeah. So but I think that the big thing is like what's Bilbo's journey of like not wanting to go on an adventure to being pulled into it, and then seeing how he moves through the story, and like does he gain his courage through different trials that he goes through, and then like what is it like whenever he gets outside of that and returns home.
The stereotypical hero's journey, like does he achieve that full arc? And it is true, especially at the beginning. He says he found his courage, which was a throwaway line for him to say, "Oh, I was going to tell you about the ring, but never mind." But that is important because his courage is something that is tested significantly through this film, especially by the end where he is trying to stand up to a beast that is hundreds of times his size and is about to eat him, right? But is playing a game with him before he eats his food. So, there is a sense in which that throwaway line actually had significance. It was no small thing for him to say that he found his courage when he has to stand up against the darkest of evils that he's faced in his life. So, no, I think that's a fair point. The other things that I think in regards to Bilbo's development, which you get a lot more in the next film, but kind of going off of the hint that we just talked about, is one of the things in the first film he talks about is this idea of like basically friendship and loyalty and doing that with this person that he just met, Thorin Oakenshield, and that real solidification of that loyalty and friendship, which was really enmity before that, right? That is what you get at the beginning of the first film and through that arc. Now, in this film, you get that, and they extend off of that. And you don't get it maybe as much as you will in the next one. But throughout this one, you see him start to affirm in public, hey, I trust this man fully. We can support him, especially when they're in Lake Town, telling the people, hey, Thorin Oakenshield is a honorable leader. We can support him in this cause to take back the Lonely Mountain and bring wealth and riches to the people. And that's where they get all the praise and whatnot. But then further on, you start to see the concern about the Arkenstone and protecting Thorin from the, spell of greed that is bestowed over it. And I'm sure that should have its own discussion, because my understanding is that is not lore accurate. But from a storytelling perspective, I think it's definitely an interesting element. And so that starts to really add some interesting dynamics of like, what does true friendship look like? What does an aspect of loyalty to someone? Is there something that supersedes loyalty to what they tell you to do? Questions like that start to be introduced, and adding a nuance to this idea of the overall themes that was first developed in An Unexpected Journey. So I thought overall I didn't have a problem with Bilbo's character, actually. I liked him a lot better in this one compared to the previous one, and part of that is because he really starts to take hold of his responsibilities and actions in this film and really move forward into the Hobbit he's supposed to be, if you will, right? So I thought it was pretty good. I don't know if you guys have anything to play off of that, but I want to open the floor at that point.
No, I think you summed up what I was going to say pretty well.
Cool. All right, what are your guys' thoughts on Thorin? Because he's really the flip side of this coin, and you see him develop in interesting ways as well. He starts off leading the company into Mirkwood, and then you also have this interesting face-off between him and Thranduil when he's imprisoned there. I don't want to get too far, because you can also talk about how he interacts with the whole spider thing and all of that, but I want to open the floor up to this new character and what your guys' impressions were of his development in this film.
Yeah, I think the big thing with Thorin in this film is his stubbornness, and how that is both a positive and negative trait for him.
Mm-hmm.
And just for dwarves in general, I love that these movies are like a deep dive into like the psyche of dwarves. And especially with Thorin, I think it's great because you see how his stubbornness makes him so unlikable at points. Like when Thranduil literally offers, for the price of a single necklace, I will let you go and equip you to go along your way. And Thorin's like, ha, screw you. Yeah. And then, at that point, you're just like, even like Bowman, one of the other dwarves, is like, why would you do this? And then at other points, you have literally everyone in Lake Town telling Thorin, no, don't take your homeland back. No, just ignore it. Don't do this. Don't do that. And Thorin's like, I'm going to do it anyways, and you can either benefit from it or not. And, it's like, Thorin not wanting to give up on finding the door and things like that. You're like rooting for him because of his stubbornness at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's why at the very end, whenever he starts to walk away from the door, it's like, oh my gosh, like he's actually giving up. That's how you know it's serious.
Mm-hmm.
So I love how Thorin has this kind of like interesting character study kind of going on in this movie. I don't think there's necessarily as much growth per se in this movie. I think there's a lot more in like the third one.
Mm-hmm.
But I really enjoyed his character a lot in this.
Yeah. Philip, what are your thoughts? I see you nodding your head a little bit over there. I see something's turning up there.
Well, I mean, I think it's cool. Like Jared was touching on that, it does try to the movie does try to reveal the nature of dwarves in a big way, especially with their stubbornness. And Thorin is like the kind of iconic example of that. I think he gets more stubborn as the movie moves on and less likable in a lot of ways. Sure. You can just think of, I mean, he still has that attitude of I'm gonna get this done no matter what. Mm-hmm. You can follow me or not. That's a big part of it. But I think to a certain extent, the dwarves are willing to follow him up, and I just get this sense of towards the end of the movie, though, he's kind of being a little bit outrageous. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things, the dwarves are not really so sure about this one. Right. So, yeah.
Yeah, especially because his main right-hand man, the voice of reason in his head, Bowman, is starting to doubt some of the decisions he's making when he was there for all of this, right? He knows everything that he's been through, and so he knows what is understandable for Thorin versus what is extreme. And when he starts to go, hey, this is extreme, you start to go, okay, he's really starting to lose it. And that's where you get maybe more of an interesting dynamic with Thorin in this film, because going back to the Arkenstone, which this might be an appropriate time to talk about that, is they have this whole idea of, oh, the Arkenstone was affecting his grandfather and turning him into this insane man with this love of gold, and that was the problem. And there's a sense in which there's almost like the power of that was affecting him before he even got the Arkenstone by his just lust and greed for this power or this riches. And you see that in how he starts interacting with the people in the group, where he goes, I'm not going to risk this mission off of a single dwarf or off of a single burglar, right? This is going to happen no matter what, and I am willing to sacrifice someone's life for the sake of achieving this end. And that's not normally the one you saw before, someone who's willing to throw his life in harm's way to save his family, right? This is the backstory that we get for Thorin previously. And so you get this slow corruption, if you will, of Thorin from being this man who was totally for the people, right, into this man who's totally for his kingdom and what he's trying to build right now. So a little more subtle, I would agree, in this one than the next one, right? Because you don't get the full manifestation of his, spoiler alert, turning on Bilbo in the next film, right? But you get at least the hints of what is to come. So, yeah, what are your guys' thoughts on the Arkenstone and using that as an element, especially because is it true to the lore? Is it not?
If I remember correctly, the Arkenstone is not that big of a piece in the book. It's there. It's definitely something there from the plot, and it has generally the same plot function, but it is... the mythology of it is 100% expanded upon in these movies. And yeah, it's interesting that they do kind of portray the Arkenstone almost as a corrupting force. Theoretically, you could argue that it would make much more sense in the lore if it was the Dwarven Ring of Power, which Thor has, Thorin's grandfather, because that was originally in his possession when Erebor fell. You could actually make a case that would be much more lore accurate and also tie it in better with Lord of the Rings.
Right.
But I digress. But yeah, so it's interesting that also just going a bit into Thorin's descent into what the third film calls dragon sickness. There are hints of it there in the book. However, it's much less of like dragon sickness as its own sort of magical disorder. It's more of just it's just more of like a Middle Earth term for greed,
right?
In the books,
okay.
It's not like something really specifically like some sort of like hallucinogenic trance as you see in the third movie. But I don't want to get into that. But yeah, I think it's just more of like the dwarves are finally, or Thorin is finally getting closer to his home, and the greed is starting to settle in. That's how it was originally written. And again, you do see that in this movie. You start to see that at the end. But yeah, so the Arkenstone, back to our main point, the Arkenstone is interestingly portrayed as almost as more of like a corrupting kind of thing. Almost as if they were trying to play off the idea of the One Ring in the original trilogy. But Philip, what do you think?
Yeah, it's been a while too since I read the book to remember everything that went on. But like, it's so horrible when movies like corrupt your like memory of things.
Right.
Right. But yeah, I think that like for Tolkien's world, I think that the stone just being a normal stone makes a lot more sense than it being necessarily like a magical thing. You don't really, okay, besides the Silmarils, which are made in another book of Lord of the Rings, but they're made and like beauty and power is put into them, right?
Right.
So, I don't really remember if the Arkenstone had much of an effect on anybody in The Hobbit, but Jared, I think, probably remembers that a lot better than I do. So
I did just forget, and I want to bring this up before I forget. The Arkenstone is not like the thing that's supposed to unite all the dwarven kingdoms like it is in the movie. That is something that they add into the movie for kind of like a more dramatic effect or to place more weight or importance on it, they make it into almost like an Excalibur type thing.
Right.
The Arkenstone is literally just like the King's Jewel. It's like the pinnacle of the collection kind of deal in Erebor. It's not meant to be this thing that like draws all dwarven clans together in defense of it. Like whoever holds it is in control of the other houses, because that makes really no sense in terms of like the dwarven power structure in Middle Earth. But I mean, I'm not like trashing on the idea. I think it's an interesting idea that the movies kind of play on, but I wanted to say that before I forget.
Sure. And isn't it more of like the fealty and familial bonds that binds them together or is it something else that really binds them in the lore?
No, it's definitely the familial bonds. Like the dwarves of the Iron Hills are Thorin's cousins. And Khazad-dûm was the original home before Erebor, so that's why they care about taking back Khazad-dûm.
Right.
Almost everything in like dwarven culture is centered on honoring your family, basically, and loyalty to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, you just look at all the Durin lines. Durin. They're all named after each other.
That's funny. True, though. Okay, yeah, that's definitely fair. Do you... Well, we could go into all the side characters. I do want to. There's so many characters we want to go with. I'm gonna shove the Necromancer scene to the side for a minute so we can complete everyone in this little world known as the company. So, you guys want to take Thranduil, or you want to take the Kili Tauriel thing that goes on? Where do you guys want to go from here?
I mean, I want to kind of talk about all of them. I have thoughts on all of
it. All right, well, let's start with Thranduil then. He's the newer addition to this whole series. You get him just briefly in the first one, The Unexpected Journey. He's the king of the Mirkwood elves, the what do they call them? The tree elves? The woodland elves, there we go. But he's a little more high and mighty type elf compared to what we've seen in The Lord of the Rings with Galadriel and with Elrond and with all of those people. What were you guys' impressions of him as a character and what he adds to the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think they need him, or like their use of him is to basically like counteract like Tauriel, and actually Legolas is even like kind of respectful of him, even like goes along with him, even though they play Thranduil to be like kind of a stern, like it's only my way or the highway kind of an attitude. So I think it's interesting. I think though, like he, in my opinion, would kind of care less about what's going on outside of his realm. Like if something. I'm trying to like keep away from like more of a book thing that I'm thinking, but
that's fine. You can like, go into it, like,
but also, yeah, I don't know. They kind of make him. I mean, they make him kind of unlikable at first, and I don't know. In the end, he doesn't really live up to any more expectations. I don't know. I don't really like him at the end of the third movie anymore, but
sure.
But yeah, I don't know. This is like some thoughts.
I mean, he's not exactly a ally in the film, so that makes sense. Jared, what were your thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts about Thranduil. I will try to keep them as contained as possible.
Nice.
Okay, so basically, my thoughts about Thranduil in this movie are, I love Elrond in Rings of Power. I love Orlando Bloom in Lord of the Rings. I think Lee Pace takes the crown as the best actor to ever portray an elf on screen. Like, he does such a good job as Thranduil. I love Lee Pace as an actor in general. But, like, he portrays Thranduil just awesomely. I was not expecting to just, like, he has such, like, a presence on screen that you just can't help but watch him. That being said, I despise the way that Thranduil is portrayed in these movies.
That's hilarious. Oh my goodness. Wow.
I know, I've never liked an actor's performance so much where I don't like how they're being portrayed, how they're being written. To be fair, in this movie, it's a little bit more closer to how Thranduil is in the book.
Okay.
This is one of those things that I have a lot of hard time separating book from the movie in terms of like my expectations. Because in this Desolation of Smaug, he does, kind of stop Thorin in the book from, like, going further in his journey. He tries to get him to, like, basically join his side, make an alliance. And he also is very much, like, kind of trying to keep his kingdom separated from the rest of the world, from the other affairs. That's something that his father did in the books as well. So that, for Thranduil, is, like, pretty decent. I'm not going to go into a rant about the third movie, but they make Thranduil a unnecessarily cruel, apathetic character, I think, in the third movie, starting a bit in this movie, that I really wasn't appreciative of, because that is not how Thranduil is portrayed in the book overall. But that's all I'm going to say for
now. That's funny. Saving it for next time. Wow. Yeah. I mean, he's definitely a, I can't really add anything to that because he's definitely an interesting character. He adds the presence for sure. And you do get him more. He's more important later on when he allies with with the Lake Town people against Thorin and his crew to try to get some of the gold that's in there. So definitely more of a sneak peek for what is to come. But yeah, definitely the stern leader. So now let's talk about Kili, Tauriel, Legolas. In my mind, they're kind of all
Kili, Tauriel.
Oh, Kili. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
man.
Kili's the blonde one.
Okay. See, that's just me not knowing. Dude, you will hear them mention them by name, and I'll still be like, oh yeah, other one, wrong name. Anyways, Kili and Tauriel, what were your guys' thoughts? Either go ahead.
Well, like, I guess I honestly, like, somehow they make it kind of work in a sense, but like at the same time, like I don't know why. It's just like a Lord of the Rings thing. Like, they don't look gruff enough to be dwarves. Like, Kili and Kili don't look gruff enough to be dwarves. And of course they're young. Mm-hmm. They're the youngest members of the company. Right. But it's like the nose isn't big enough. Like, all these other things. It's almost like they made them look good to, like, have this romance in the movie so that, like, people would, like, get this flame. Like, oh, well, hey, what do you know? Like, and if anybody knows anything from the Lord of the Rings, like, Legolas and Gimli don't get along for quite a bit. Right. Elves and dwarves don't like each other, so they're going with that, kind of a thing. I don't know. It just, like, to be honest, like, overall, I think that, like, in the way that the movie paced things and how, like, and, like, the content they put in there wasn't really so much that, like, was watered down, except for, like, the point where Tauriel is in Lake Town healing Kili's leg. And I mean, and this, like, it's not necessarily a huge thing, but I actually, after watching this, found so many tiebacks to the Lord of the Rings movies that I feel like that they were trying to swing. And I'm like, how could I never catch this before? And
Don't
like,
you
and
know?
to me, I'm like,
Tauriel is like, just Arwen. Didn't you know that?
Yeah, but it's like, it's crazy. Like, they actually did it but they do it in such a way that it's subtle enough. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are other quotes that go on that I was a little bit like, okay, that's directly from, like, Gandalf and, like, the Fellowship of the Ring. Mm-hmm. But anyways, so that's, like, it's just a fling. I don't know. It's just a fling. It just kind of makes me just be like, this is unneeded. Let's cut to the chase on the storyline.
Right.
A little bit more. That's just kind of my opinion. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jared. I see you just fuming in the corner.
All right. So let me preface by saying that again, it's kind of like almost a similarity thing with like Lee Pace and Thranduil. I love Evangeline Lilly as an actress, and I also think she does a great job as Tauriel. I actually don't mind Tauriel herself as a character. I think she's perfectly fine, like fitting into the world of Middle Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like her involvement in the story. I don't like the story written around her at all. It infuriates me. They literally like shoehorn this like romance in specifically for like this Arwen callback that just ends up looking really bizarre. Like when I remember when I was watching this with someone who had never seen the Hobbit movies before, and like we got to the part where she was like looking at Kili, like grounding up plants, chanting while the light was shining behind her. My friend was like, "What am I watching?" And I was like, I don't know, man. So like, here's the thing: is that I understand because I was watching this documentary where they were explaining why they introduced Tauriel into the story.
Uh-huh.
They made up an interesting point that in the Hobbit book there isn't a single female character. And that's part of why they wanted to like introduce Tauriel. They wanted to have a female character. And you know what? Like to a degree, I'm like, yeah, you know what? I understand that. I can get that. And they actually create Tauriel, who isn't a bad character.
Right.
But then they undermine that whole thing by putting her in a love triangle with Legolas and a dwarf. And I'm just like, why?
Because he's tall for a dwarf. That's why.
Apparently. Apparently. And also, side note, as much as I love Orlando Bloom, I hate that Legolas is in this movie. I understand that he's Thranduil's son, and I would have been happy with a cameo, but him and Tauriel going off into Lake Town, I could not handle that. With the whole thing with them fighting out this long, drawn fight with orcs on a roof, I was so over it. I was like, go back to the dragon.
Yeah. Well, the thing that gets me so much is... like, so the first time that Tauriel and Kili went in the dungeon, and Kili says something about down his pants. And I'm like, where in the world does that come from? Like, you've got to be joking me. It's like this is let's talk about Tolkien here. Let's talk about like the way Tolkien did things in it. Like, we're like, this is like, I have this like, what?
No, I totally agree.
This is like,
that's how you pull ladies, don't you know?
Well, yeah, and here's the thing, too, is that, like, 30 seconds after you have that exchange, whatever that is, Tauriel has this gorgeous monologue about her walking among the starlight. And I'm just like, what kind of tonal whiplash are we going through here in the name of this romance?
Yeah, it was just... Oh, I remembered watching the third one, where, spoiler alert, he dies, right? And talking to some of my lady friends about it, and they were like, oh, that was so sad. I was like, no, that's the best part. They killed off this stupid romance that started in the last movies.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then anyways, there's something else about the third movie too, with all the lines that went around that situation too. At the end there was like horrible. But
yeah. We'll leave that movie for that movie, but you know, for now, let's just say they started off, and man, did they just throw that right in the garbage. And in my opinion, and everyone else is here, don't do that.
Honestly, you could have tied in, I think, Tauriel's story into Gandalf's story, because her whole thing is like...
Oh, you just mean in regards to the plot, not the romance triangle.
Not romance.
Okay.
Dear goodness.
It's a square. It's a square this time. It's a square.
Holy crap. Whoa.
Let me clarify for any listener on this podcast, I do not ship Tauriel and Gandalf.
Oh my.
Most important distinction of the century. What I mean to say, though, is that, like, because Tauriel's whole thing in the beginning of this movie is that, like, spiders are coming up from the south. We need to care more about what's going on in our forest, but also what's going on in the world at large.
Right.
And what's Gandalf's storyline? There's a bigger thing affecting the world at large.
Right.
Having Tauriel maybe guide Gandalf into the ruins of Dol Guldur or something like that, or having her have some sort of connection with like Radagast and bringing her into that storyline, I thought that would have been like a better kind of story then a love triangle.
Mm-hmm.
But I digress.
Right. We'll see. Maybe she's just using Kili as a rebound since Thranduil said she couldn't be with his son.
Oh, don't even
important thoughts of the century. Anyways, let's move on. I want to discuss Smaug at some point just to give him the honor that he deserves. But the last person I think that should be mentioned in this whole group of people is Bard the Bowman. What are your guys' thoughts of Bard's introduction in this film, especially in regards to his role in the books? Is he really a big part of the books at all? I don't recall much about him. So
I mean,
here's the thing with Bard is that like he shows up right before he kills the dragon, and then he's an important character.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So they are retroactively making him a bigger character in this, which I, for the sake of the movie, I totally get, support. I think making him be more of like a political dissident figure, I don't really like as much. I think it like introduces some decent, plot conflict, especially with the Master of Lake Town, who is awful. But when you read Bard in The Hobbit, I don't think I've ever once thought to myself, I could really watch a political storyline about this guy. I don't see where that really would have come from. I would have thought they would have taken like a more fantastical route, because he's mentioned as a great hunter. He has this lucky black arrow that's been passed down for generations in his hands. I thought they would maybe do something more with that. But instead, he's bartering about like how to move fish through the canals
I see.
and navigating that political landscape, which, I mean, is a choice. Like, it's not the choice I would have made, but
Right. Yeah, Philip, what were your thoughts?
Well, anyway, so when he does like defeat Smaug in that sense, like that's his thing. Like the only person who would be able to shoot a bow well enough would take down the dragon. So actually the black bolt thing isn't even in the books.
Okay.
Like,
right.
I'm pretty sure.
Well, he has it's literally a black arrow, like an actual like one that you draw with a bow that happens to be lucky. It's not made by dwarves, and it's not part of this dwarvish windlands kind of thing. I was about that. I understand that they wanted to make the arrow bigger so that it looked more threatening up against Smaug, who they sized up for this movie. But, like, that whole thing was just really weird.
Right.
Yeah. So he was just more of, like, this expert marksman who, like, when he finds the wound, he's like, all right, I got it.
Right. Nice.
So, anyway, so I feel like in that sense, he's a little bit more BA than they give him in the movie.
Okay.
Yeah, because you only see him use a bow once in in Desolation of Smaug. It's like when he kind of shoots the dwarves at their feet.
Right.
I think that's the only time you see him use the bow.
True.
Yeah, and he does. Obviously, he's an expert marksman at that point because he shoots the rock out of the guy's hand and stuff like that. But yeah, you really don't see him in action, really. And you don't get that epic scene until the next one where he puts it on his son's shoulders. We're all dying to see that. Anyways, before we move on to the next film, let's stay in this one. The only thing I will say about Bard myself is that the pace of the movie when he enters the scene is very different, and I appreciate that breakup in that the entire movie up to Lake Town is them pretty much being put in a situation and escaping from it. Being put in a situation and escaping from it. Versus even though the diplomatic political intrigue side is not a huge part of everything before it, because the only political intrigue you get, quote unquote, before that is, hey, Thranduil, shove off. I don't care about you, which isn't really much of political intrigue. It's pretty much go back to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. So in this case, you actually get a little more of okay, let's try to maneuver around this. How do we work with the people? Oh, maybe I can turn this terrible situation to my benefit by saying I'm here to give you all free cash, right? And trying to use different opportunities to his benefit was, I think, interesting in a different framework for it, which was kind of important just because even with the amount of in-situation escape situations we had in the Desolation of Smaug itself, not even counting the first one, it does start to get a little repetitive, and you start to go, okay, they're in a situation, they're probably going to escape, right? It starts to get a little predictable. So I do appreciate it from that standpoint. Was it true to his character? I don't know. Did it add a ton in regards to plot? It helps develop Bard, which would be important for the next film, and that needs to stand on its own right. So I'll leave that one out for the jury for now, but all that to say, it's interesting. Smaug.
Yeah, but
No, go ahead. Please go.
Jared, like, isn't in the Hobbit wasn't Bard like a little more respected by everybody than like they're given off in
I mean, they kind of show that in the film with like the townsfolk are the ones who are kind of like see him as like the people's champion, and that's kind of why he's like this almost pseudo rival political leader or this political threat to the master of Lake Town. I don't really think there was much of any sort of interaction between the master or Bard at all. I don't even know if like they like even mention each other. I think Bard maybe mentions that he was an idiot at one point. But like other than that, I don't think there was too much. And everyone else, they were kind of like afraid of Bard because Bard was very described as being very grim, very silent kind of. And so I think the other people in the town kind of like feared him a little bit, but they also respected him, like you were saying. Yeah.
So Smaug gets revealed. We already talked about how epic that was, right? But for him as a character, he is the built-up to villain in the story, even to a certain degree more so than the Necromancer is, in my opinion. What are your guys' thoughts on his revelation as a villain, how they play him out in this film? What are your thoughts? We'll start with Philip. What did you think?
Great. Honestly, like, I think he did, like, just great portrayal. Honestly, I don't know. Like, that's who's so is it what's his face? The guy who Benedict Cumberbatch. Yeah. Does a great job, I think, with the voice and all, and I think just like it was even this time when I watched it, when I see like Smaug open his eye and when Bilbo's standing there, and then you like look over and you see like his tail move all the way over there, and it's like, oh wow, he's that big. So I think that was neat. I think that, like, just because I go off a little bit of like on a book side of things too, I think I would have liked to hear like some more riddles go back and forth between them, because that's what happens in the book. They have more riddles, just like riddles in the dark with Gollum and Bilbo. So like this kind of thing, like Bilbo's good at riddles, you know, and Smaug's smart. So anyways, yeah. But I mean, overall, like, I think the one thing that did get me when I watched this for the first time was I thought Desolation of Smaug, and in my mind, that meant that Smaug was going to die.
Interesting.
Because I thought Desolation of Smaug, not like Smaug's like destroying anything.
Right.
So at the end of the movie, like the first time I watched it, I remember just being like, wait, he's just like, okay, he's flying off to the next thing and then end. But it didn't seem like it was like a cliffhanger end. It seemed like it was a stop. And it was like, okay, so like he's going to Dale. But like, I mean, me knowing the book at that point, I'm like, come on, let's get to the Battle of the Five Armies.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
That's, anyway, so that's...
It does,
I mean,
yeah. Well, it feels like a little bit of a tease, you know, to show you all the way up to there and then go, nah, you can't see this. You don't get to see what happens. Definitely, I get that sentiment. But keep going. Didn't mean to cut you off too much.
Oh yeah, I was just saying that I think that the way they portrayed him was good. Like, just kind of the cunning. I feel like a dragon kind of needs to be cunning, like a snake or something, you know. So, yeah.
Nice, Jared.
Yeah, so I just love how they did Smaug in this movie. You can, I don't know if it's just me projecting, but I think I can kind of tell that everyone was putting all of their chips into the Smaug scenes in this movie. Because, I mean, if you even look at, like, the special effects, I think the special effects in this particular scene are much better than a lot of other parts of the movie. Like, this is where they were putting all of their dwarven coins down on the table. And Benedict Cumberbatch, as he does in almost everything, just like gives it his all. And so does Martin Freeman, who just is so funny and absolutely terrified at the same time. I know that a scene is good when they cut away from it and you're annoyed.
Right.
You're like, no, go back to it. Because every time they cut away from Smaug to show any other plot line, I'm like, ugh, no.
Right.
Yeah, I just love Smaug. I'm not really happy with like the climax of this movie with the dwarves. I don't know if you want to save that to talk about that a bit later.
No, please. Now is the appropriate time. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So I see that when I was talking about how this is a good movie that struggles under the weight of its own expectations, my first impressions of the movie, I think that there is like no more glaring obvious flaw than the climax of this movie, because it's very obvious that there was not a great place to stop this movie except for like right before he reaches Lake Town as a cliffhanger.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is, what's the climax then? Because with Lord of the Rings, everyone got used to the idea of having a big battle as your climax. Helm's Deep established that. Moria established that. And then obviously the battles in Return of the King. And even The Hobbit kind of played on this with the idea of them fighting the wargs. So by the time you get to this movie, you're like, well, we can't have Bilbo and the dragon talking being our climax.
Right.
Because that's how the scene plays out in the books. And then the dragon bursts from the mountain. So they decide to go for spectacle in this. And they have the dwarves going on mining roller coasters and doing death-defying stunts and surfing on rivers of molten gold to somehow pour them into a statue mold that just happened to be set up in the Great Hall, that they can conveniently undo all the clasps to bathe Smaug in gold, but like, he's a dragon, so obviously the heat doesn't affect him, which you would think the dwarves would know. And then it's only kind of redeemed by that one glorious shot of Smaug soaring up into the sky as the gold is flying off him under the moonlight. That's like one of the only redeeming parts of that whole scene. But like, and you have somewhat of like an emotional scene with Bilbo being like, please don't go after the people of Lake Town.
Mm-hmm.
And Smaug is like, oh, then I'll do it just to hurt you kind of deal. That whole interchange is really good. But like the whole thing beforehand with like Thorin standing on top of this gold statue of his grandfather, I was just like, I can't take this seriously. I can't. And like, also that whole chase scene was like 10 minutes too long. If you actually look at the time of the movie, it is a 25-minute chase scene of the dwarves and Smaug going through multiple tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
And I get so bored of it halfway through, which I shouldn't be getting bored of a dragon.
Right.
Like, I should never be getting bored of a dragon, but somehow I still end up doing that. So I think that just the expectation that there has to be a big action climax, and they had to literally just write one in just because, but they knew that they couldn't have any actual stakes or resolution because they still needed all of those characters there for the third movie.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the big thing that let this whole movie down.
Right.
That's the end of my rant.
Right. No, and honestly, that was one of the things I remember thinking, even especially in this watch through, where they have all the dwarfs separate, and they build up how Smaug is supposed to be this very clever dragon, right? He's very clever, and they say that multiple times. But then, oh, there's dwarves over here. No, there's dwarves over here. No, there's dwarves over here. And, Smaug just keeps turning his head like he's some sort of, I don't know, bird watching people get his attention. Look at me, right? And it's like, if he's really this clever, he's going to go turn around. Now we'll chomp you. Now we'll chomp. Like, he's not going to waste his time. He's going to be very direct, which he is later in the film, or in the next one anyways, where he's like, all right, I'm going straight to Lake Town and everyone's dying, right? He has a very clear idea of what he wants to do. And as soon as he decides he's done playing with Bilbo, guess what? It's time to burn him to a crisp. So it's it's really weird that he's portrayed very, very well up into that one scene that's supposed to be this big climactic scene, and then it gets very convoluted for him as a character where he becomes this, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I took a bunch of drugs as a dragon kid, and now my brain's just eggs. So, it was very weird. Really disappointed with that, just like you were. So I don't know what else to really say, except if they had at least chomped up 2 of those dwarves, I would have been a little happier, even if that isn't canon, just because it would have at least showed some stakes.
We have dwarves to spare at this point.
Basically. I mean, kind of.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing, too, is that, I was watching some of the appendices, the behind-the-scenes stuff that comes along with this movie.
Right.
And even Peter Jackson admitted that when they got to this climax of the movie, he didn't know how to end it. There is no script, and there was no storyboarding for this.
Oh, really?
They literally... Yeah, there was not even storyboard, because they had to basically just come up with this, and they shot a few shots of the dwarves so that they could just try and figure out what they were going to do with those shots in a few weeks.
Wow.
Because they didn't really know what they were going to do. And then also they were really pressed for time, which I think is another thing that hurts these movies too, is that there was so much pressure to put these movies out on time on a yearly schedule, which I think really hurt them overall. But
yeah. Philip, you have any additional thoughts on that?
Oh, one thing just off of that, I think that Peter Jackson, I don't know that he was the original head producer.
Okay.
I think that they switched, and so he had to pick up where the other guy left off.
Guillermo del Toro, yeah.
Yeah. But also I think that in these movies, if they shifted around certain parts going to the first movie, or kind of ending this one a little shorter. I mean, I don't know, the way they kind of revealed Smaug, even just have an opening on his eye and then end it, I felt like that might have been a decent way of being oh, well, there's Smaug. Oh, we guess we gotta wait till the next movie to see to check out Smaug. And then that would have cut off more time that they were spending there to try to figure out how to end things. But I mean,
right.
I mean, of course, I'm not somebody who produces movies, so I don't really know what the best way to end the movie would be.
Well, yeah. Kind of going off of what you said at the beginning of this podcast, right? You said they end this film with Smaug driving off into the moonlight, going, I'm going to burn everything. And then it ends and you go, well, there's 3 chapters left in this book. What are they going to put in that? I actually had the very opposite understanding of this based off of the film and how they portrayed it, because you have 4 things that have to be figured out in the next film, right? You have to figure out Smaug and Lake Town. You have to figure out the Necromancer, right? You have to figure out the Battle of the 5 Armies, and you got to figure out this whole Arkenstone thing that's going on. So these are all all pretty big things too. They're not small things. And so when I watched this film at the end, I was for the first time going, this is going to be a lot in the next film. And are they really going to be able to do it justice with so many huge things? It's just going to be action-packed. There's not going to be time for development. What's
Spoiler
going
alert,
on?
no.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think that's true. That's true. I think that's another thing I mean, I can't remember perfectly about the book, but I don't because he made it for kids who are 10 to 13, basically, in that kind of range. He doesn't put that's why I think there's a lot to see in the book that really isn't delved into a whole lot. So we have a lot that happens that for a movie, I get hey, if we're talking about all this stuff, it's gonna take a bigger movie to capture all of this.
Right.
But
it's a brilliant segue into the Necromancer plot.
That's right. So let's get on that now. What are you guys' thoughts on Gandalf and the whole Necromancer scenario that they develop in this film? Was it true to obviously it's not in The Hobbit really, it's hinted at, but it's more of a side bit that you get out of the Silmarillion. What are your guys' thoughts on how they developed that, how accurate it was, all of that stuff?
If I could just do real quick and then let Jerry just go for it.
Sure.
But because I think that the whole appendices thing was great. And the way they added some of those side things, I I don't know 100% if like everything was accurate with the nine and like how they came across, but I think that like where they took that storyline, to me especially, it's just like a fan, I would have been like, oh wow, this is really cool. This wasn't in the Hobbit, but these things were happening at the same time.
Yeah. So I thoroughly enjoy this plot line, especially because like all you get about Gandalf's thing is that he went to a council of the good wizards and great elven lords, and then they went to Dol Guldur and drove the Necromancer out. That's literally all the hint you get. And like if they hadn't put that in this movie, it would have been the worst tease ever. Like I think that it was a perfect thing to put in, and also to like tie it into Lord of the Rings and everything. I think it was great. Also, just like getting to see Gandalf really out of his element in Dol Guldur, I thought was really cool because you never really see, even when Gandalf's fighting the Balrog, it's still awesome, and you don't really feel like Gandalf's necessarily afraid or out of his element. But like in Dol Guldur, you get to see Gandalf kind of like going around, and it's almost like a thriller suspense kind of thing,
right?
Which I think was really neat for Middle Earth and the Hobbit movies. And they added in this really nice like texture to it. So I really, really enjoyed it. Especially like, having like Radagast and Gandalf like having these conversations about like the nature of the Nine returning. And also just like Sauron's portrayal in this was really, really, really cool. Because again, I love watching the appendices and the behind the scenes stuff because I love hearing what the filmmakers have to say about this. They said that they really struggled with putting Sauron in this because it's very hard to portray Sauron on screen because your imagination is always going to be better or more scary than whatever they show on screen. So I thought that like the way that they had Sauron almost as like a living void or a living shadow, and then inverting to form the eye with like the flames around him, I was like, that is a brilliant way of like portraying the unportrayable.
Right.
So, and you also just got this horrible sense of dread and power, which you should get from Sauron at this point, even though he's only a shadow in Dol Guldur. So I was really, really happy with this. I have a little bit more conflicted thoughts on how the story plays out in the Battle of Five Armies, but that's for a different movie.
Right.
But yeah, overall, I was really, really happy with how they did this plot line in Desolation of Smaug.
Yeah, I will say of any of the films, like that scene that you're talking about the inversion of the image, that sticks in my mind as like I remember watching that and going, that was awesome. I don't care who you are. That looks so cool. So as a fan of like the stories and more knowing a little bit more of the lore, not just a casual viewer compared to most people, I appreciated the whole arc. Like the whole arc is just love that they went down that tangent. My only real gripe with it, honestly, is like it is very much a divergence from the rest of the plot that goes on in all of The Hobbit, and it's not very easy to reconcile the two. It's a very cool side tangent, but I'm not sure how much it adds to the main plot, even when it comes back around and Gandalf rejoins with the company. So, it's I do
Real
have.
Quick, if there's something.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah. If there's something I can add, this was actually going to be something Tolkien actually talked about this briefly, and they had this in the movie originally, and they cut it as a deleted scene that still didn't even make it into the extended edition. Gandalf at one point was going to find a Palantir in Dol Guldur. He was going to touch it, and he was going to see that Sauron was going to recruit Smaug, and basically have Smaug lead his armies out of Mordor, and like Gondor would have fallen and everything. And Tolkien mentions I forget where exactly at one point, but he does say that Sauron was thinking about making an alliance with Smaug, and that was Gandalf's main worry. Not necessarily the dwarves reclaiming their homeland, but about what Smaug could do. And I don't understand why that was taken out of the movie, because like that ties it in perfectly with the main plot.
Right.
Like getting to see a vision of Smaug allying with Sauron, like that would make perfect sense. So I just thought that was like a huge bit of like wasted potential right there.
Right, and that's directly relevant. So that's a very good point. I see you, Philip, over there, kind of like. Do you have anything you want to add?
Oh man, not really. I think that what I thought was cool. They kept it kind of mysterious, like as they like led into it. Like and they talk about the nine, so like where the nine come out of their graves, and I was like a little bit unsure about this, a little bit confused because I thought that the men when they put on the rings, that they then turn into wraiths slowly, and they don't actually die and get put in graves. But anyways, but I still thought like that whole situation was really cool. But
they mentioned this in the first movie. Galadriel says this is something they add in from the lore, because the actual like the nine are just kind of hanging out in various places throughout most of the Third Age.
Okay,
they're just kind of chilling, honestly. But they add this into the movie. In the first movie, Galadriel says, when Angmar fell, they buried the Witch King in a tomb so dark that it would never see the sun. So I think that they implied that they like somehow force the ring wraiths into these tombs, and now that Sauron's back, like the ring wraiths have like burst out of them. I think that's what they were implying with that. That's not something from the lore. But yeah, it was good. It was a good thing of like with seeing the open graves and everything. You know, great bit of like suspense and everything there. Yeah. So I'm not gonna begrudge them that. Yeah, because that was pretty epic.
Yeah,
it was creepy, and I felt like it was creepy, and that was like a good fit. So
yeah, just adding to the ominous elements around the Necromancer and who he is, and the full revelation of him as being Sauron who has returned. So yeah, I loved that scene as well, Philip. I thought it was a great addition. Yeah, I mean that's most of that we get in this film. Obviously, we get more in the next one, but in regards to how they leave this film, what are your guys' thoughts on this film specifically, the lasting impact of it?
Well, one last thing that we didn't talk about was the barrels.
True. You're right. We didn't talk about the barrels. Oh my goodness.
And how that just was, I think, too long. And to give I was like, I'm not going to let this one go. Not going to let this one go.
Fair.
Tell us, Philip, about these barrels. I'm ready.
Okay, so all right. Part of it's a book thing, but part of it also I think is how they're trying to stretch these orcs running across and the elves like running across this all of like half of Middle Earth, you know, to find the dwarves. And it kind of just takes away from like what's the main like what should be the main focus of this. It should be like around like the group of the dwarves going to Erebor and, you know, reclaiming the mountain. And I just felt like part of like with Aragorn and Legolas and Tauriel, like that's just kind of taking away from that and adding in something else that really isn't needed.
Like Legolas standing on a dwarf's head to shoot an orc in the face?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, in a sense, like who wouldn't want to see like more about like the world than like you get from just the text? In a sense, so it's cool to see other things in the world that you wouldn't be able to see. I mean, it's good that like you have Bilbo riding with him on the barrels, but like
you don't need to defend it, Philip. It's okay.
Bombor. How about that? Was it Bombor?
Yeah.
Bong.
Where did the other barrel come from? That he just happens to have an extra one laying around that he jumps into?
Yeah. I don't know. It's just like, to me, I always thought that if they fit it into 2 movies, it would have been better.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always thought. Like, if they fit it into 2 movies, it would have been better. Also, Sorry, I didn't mean to
interrupt. If we're going to talk about lore gripes for 1 second, Morgul blades, like the thing that stabbed Frodo, are supposed to be powerful, dark, cursed weapons, alright? Somehow, for some reason, a random orc has a Morgul shaft arrow that he happens to just launch at one of the least important dwarves. And then it becomes necessary for the romance plot. What is a Morgul arrow? What is that? Did the race have one? Did they have like a secret bow that we don't know about? And why does this random orc have one? And why is he wasting it on dwarves? I don't get it.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's my gripe.
I guess like the thing is that like it's just like the orcs running after the dwarves. Legolas and Tauriel weren't running after the dwarves, and that whole thing. Just like I was saying, like you can remove it. Just like you can remove like the master and the steward or whoever, and you can like, and I feel like you'd have a more succinct, like, kind of driven movie in like in a certain direction that would keep people more interested.
Yeah. Well, and I recall distinctly the barrel scene as one of the first times where I recall as an audience getting the real impression of an attempt at an epic scene, if you will, right? Where I felt like the creators of the story were not just creating, like you get with Lord of the Rings at the very beginning, you get that grand sweeping battle of the original fight for the One Ring, right? And destroying Sauron. And that felt like this is high fantasy. And this gave you the idea that this is what high fantasy looks like. Grand epic battles, great evil, great heroes, all of that. And this has almost been the gold standard, if you will, from then of this is what epic looks like. And it seems like you can almost tell when it goes from we are trying to portray something that is truly epic as best as we can into we are trying to make the coolest scene you have ever seen. Check this out. This guy's standing on two dwarves' heads and shooting an arrow at the same time. Bro, it's so cool. Like, that is the kind of feel you get from the barrel riding scene. And I feel like Hollywood has gone with this idea of let's make epic scenes rather than let's make good stories, starting with stuff like this and going on to the Battle of Five Armies, going into plenty of other films, but just sticking to the lore here currently. You see that in The Rings of Power today a little bit. This isn't a TV show podcast, so we're not going to go too deep into that, but that kind of thing that you've seen, I really started to see that around this time, and it continued to develop from there. So not a good sign of what was to come, and boy, did it come. So here we are. Yeah, that's all I got on that. In regards to the lasting impact of this film, what did you guys think? Is it going to be a film that we talk about in years to come, or is this one that's going to die with the dogs?
I could not remember going to this. Like, I knew the storyline. Sure. I knew the storyline, and I'd seen the movie before. But like, yeah, maybe it's like what you're saying. Maybe they're trying to be too epic. Like, maybe they're trying to tie back too much to Lord of the Rings. Like, just do the Hobbit. It's like, just do this, And like, I don't know. Lose your focus, lose your shirt.
Nice. Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Yeah, let's go!
Wow, he made it into the podcast. That's crazy.
Let's go, dude.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, dude. I didn't know if you took that class.
Go ahead, Jared.
So, here's the thing. As much as I love these movies, especially Hobbit 1 and 2, I love them, not because they're necessarily the best written movies in the world, because they have like a lot of sentimental value, things like that. I will acknowledge that the Hobbit trilogy is like the younger sibling of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and Lord of the Rings trilogy was the popular one in high school, who was loved by all the teachers, and the Hobbit movies tried to be like them, failed, and were forever bitter about it.
Nice.
That sounds really cruel and really mean, but like that is kind of the vibe I get about it, because like when you ask people about the Hobbit movies, they can tell you, oh, there was a dragon, and there was the Hobbit Bilbo, and there was a grumpy dwarf.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you ask them about Lord of the Rings, they can like quote it verbatim to you.
Nice.
Yeah, and like here's the thing: is like, don't get me wrong, I love the Hobbit movies. They mean a lot to me. I think they're actually fairly well made. But I think that overall, like the story really starts to break down, and that the trilogy suffers a lot overall, and the rot starts really badly in Desolation of Smaug, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that sentiment. As much as I have problems with the first one, really you start to see the downgrade of quality in this one. Not because the CGI is bad, not because the actors are bad, not because Smaug is portrayed poorly, but just because the plot itself actually had serious flaws. And you get that moving forward. Philip, what are your final thoughts on this?
Overall, they put it into 2 movies. They could have easily moved some things around, while like the Mirkwood part like seems to be like a good halfway point maybe in the book. Maybe that's not a good halfway point for the movies. Maybe more could have been put into the first movie to make the more room for stuff in the second movie.
Mm-hmm.
But that's,
Right.
But, these things aren't easy. Like, heck, man, if I was writing it, I would want to put in stuff and do my own things. It's Middle Earth, doggone it. You know what I mean? But still, not like I haven't said a whole lot positive about it. I feel like in this one, but
sure.
Had to give a little bit of a shout to things. But
Yeah,
overall, like, it's still like has a certain quality to it that keeps you interested enough, despite like maybe like the lore inaccuracies or all this other stuff. You can still like sit down and watch the thing and you enjoy it. Like while you still have like these irritations about certain things, and it's not as bad as like the last one. But yeah, I'm rambling, but
sure.
Yeah.
Well, no, and that's a good point. It's definitely not all bad, right? And like Jared just said, it was the start of the downhill spiral. So I would watch it again. It's not terrible. It's just like, man, it's so sad to see it go, and this is where it really falls. So that's what you're getting with this podcast, and that's pretty much all we have to say. I don't know that unless anyone's going to downgrade their rating more, I don't get the impression anyone's opinion was changed for the positive for this one, unless I'm reading that wrong. No? Yeah, so that's the pod. If you guys want to follow Philip with the White City Podcast, that's right. Is that where you find it? The whitecitypodcast.com. Is that a good location?
Yep, go to the whitecitypodcast.com. On YouTube, look into @the White City Podcast just for like our tag, and you'll find us there as well. Then just search us on Spotify. Search on Spotify will be one of the first ones to come up.
Nice. And Jared has been a guest on that podcast as well. So if you want to hear more thoughts from him, go ahead and check him out there as well. Jared, do you have anything else you want to plug before we wrap it up here?
No, I'm good.
Well, it was a pleasure having you on. You too, Philip. We appreciate both of you guys' inputs. We will be back, as we always are, next week. See you all then.